I thought what I was going to do today was actually take a combination of what Tony talked about, right? So if you remember from the morning, Tony talked about things breaking, right, and going fast and all that fun stuff. And then something that Jonathan just talked about, which is, org structure and managers, right? And we put a lot of importance on being a good manager, but what the hell does it mean to be a good manager? And as Tony said, you always have incidents, right? So you merge those two things together, which is everyone in this room is in a leadership role, and every one of us has bugs, right? So what I'd like to ask everyone here is, who's done a post-mortem on their own incidents? Anyone? Ah, good. That's pretty good. So I'm going to do a public one. I'm going to do a public one on... This has probably been one of my biggest incidents that I've repeated and repeated over time. It's one that's probably had the biggest impact on my leadership abilities on my teams. And I think finally in the last 18 months or so, I've as Tony said, you don't get to the root cause for a while, right? You try to get better and you get better, and sometimes you monkey patch it. Sometimes you put some things in place to make sure you don't make things worse. And this is one that it has been a bit of an eureka moment the last year or so about actually coming to the root cause, and I've been a bit blind to what it is, and a lot of people have influenced this, people on my team, et cetera. So that's kind of what I wanted to do, is walk through a postmortem, and let's walk through the action items that came out of it that I think are going to be super useful for literally everyone in this team. It has been for all of us at Shopify, and some of the stuff I'm going to show you is WIP, work in progress, right? So some of this stuff is aspirational, as in we've come to some agreement that this will make a huge improvement, and some of this stuff is tried, true, and tested as well. So like many of you, at some point in your career, you will go to Google and type up, what does it mean to be a CTO, right? And if you do that, you will find a lot of mind maps. Has anyone done that at some point? Yeah? Yeah, come on, be honest, yeah? And what's fascinating when you see these mind maps, and listen, don't try and read anything, it's not that important, but this is a to-do list, right? This is a list of ordered things, right? On this is the top three are like culture, people, and technology, right? The stuff you kind of assume, and at some point, you'll say, man, there's like more stuff that I have to be aware of, and I've got to make sure that I've got a great operations team, got to make sure that I do culture stuff. But the one thing missing out of this, right, is how the hell do you do this, right? What tools do you use to do this, right? I'm not going to use the exact same tools I used when I was developing. I'm not going to use the same tools I'm using when I had a team of 3-4 people, right? You've got 50, 100 people, like very, very different tools. And nothing in here is going to highlight some of those tools. So it took me, probably 8 years or so, as Bruce said, had an opportunity to be on different teams, and I flew to Australia, and kind of the first time working for like the 30-year-old CEO, right, who was kind of going through this journey with me. And one thing about him which was great is he actually was a good manager, right? Although he couldn't see into the future, he gave really good feedback, right? He gave feedback that was true, that was on time. And I'm going to share some of the feedback he gave to me and why it took me 8 years to even appreciate the feedback he was trying to give me, and the outcome of what tools that are way better than having a to-do list that I think has helped you kind of be a great leader. So the first thing he told me in our first one-on-one at some point, and I've heard this repeatedly through my career, is, hey, Jean-Michel, you're really good at setting direction, right? Like you can stand on the bow of a boat, right, and point and say, let's go across the Atlantic. That sounds fun. There's something really shiny at the other end, and you can get people on the boat with you, right? You can convince them you've got a good story, and you probably have a good reason why you want to cross the Atlantic, right? Like you're not BSing people. It's probably a good mission, right? And that was good. Like that was needed. I remember at that time Scott was telling me, right, Jean-Michel, keep doing that. That's awesome, right? So you leave those one-on-ones, you're like, man, that's great, I'm doing my job, right? And you guess what the second thing he told me? and this is the first time I heard this word, is hey, Jean-Michel, you're great at hand-to-hand combat, right? So when the shit hits the fan, if there's some technical decisions to be made, you can fix the engine, right? You can help the team decide that the engine needs fixing, right? You've been there before. You know when there's smoke, right? You can tell when it's smoking, right? Which is a good tool, right? Like, these are good tools to have, right? But he was like, but feels like there's something missing, right? I can't tell you what it is. He's a great manager, but he couldn't really tell me what it was. And it took me a while. The other thing is I'm actually a sailor as well. So there's a bit of a mix about how the sailing stories have come in to help kind of decide what was missing. Let's see if it's actually wrong button. So I'm gonna use some like business terms, which are gonna make all of us a bit uncomfortable, right? But I think that was one of the impediments, I think, for me for realizing one of these tools that was like not in my toolbox. So Scott, again, was giving me feedback saying your mission is great, and that's literally like doing mission stuff, right? Like setting direction, communicating it, and in the case of sailing, it's deciding to cross the Atlantic. And I was really good at tactics, right? Because that's what you learn doing, right? You get promoted because your tactics are great, right? You rarely get promoted if you don't have really good tactics, right? So that's kind of the easy thing as you get into your next job to kind of lean into, and you kind of know you're going to be good at it, so you keep doing more and more of it, right? So you do those two things, right? But you realize there's kind of this gap in the middle, right? What the hell is that thing called? It's called strategy. Man, that S word. Has anyone took a strategy course? No? Okay, those watching the video, no hands went up, right? We talk about it a lot, so what the hell is it, right? And this is the eureka moment for me, and it happened 2 years ago, which is I tried to realize, like, I sail quite a bit, I skipper boats, bring my family out, and I spend most of my time at this table, right? It's called a nav table. It's where you have maps, right? It's where you have tide tables, you have a lot of books about currents, et cetera. Like, this is where you do your planning, right? And it hit me after a while. I'm like, man, like, this is strategy, right? So that's what's missing, right? Like, what is the map that each one of us is using to connect the vision to the tactics, right? So imagine if you're sailing, you need a map. Like, the map is basically going to decide, like, you're going to have to decide, when do we leave, right? Why are we going in a certain direction? What terrain is around us that we should be aware of? You have a logic about why you start in a certain direction, right? That's what maps are, right? Maps are giving you that tool that you can actually talk about strategy, And that, for me, I replaced the word strategy with maps now, right? Because everyone, when they think strategy, they think about a SWOT table, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And they hear that, and they, like, especially as an engineer, you kind of like well up, man. I don't want to hire an MBA, and I've never had a course in that. But maps are familiar. We use them all the time, but we never use them for our jobs, right? So that's what I want to dig into today. Strategizing, right, which is, again, what maps do really well are sharing situational awareness, right? They look at the situation, and they explain the why. Why are we leaving at 6 a.m. on a Sunday in November? Well, that's because we've looked at the weather patterns for the last 100 years, and we realize that we have to go before the hurricane season, and we know that the trade winds are going to kick in kind of the 15th of November because we looked at data for the last 200 years. That's the why, right? That's the situational awareness to help us decide why we're making certain moves, right? How many people here use maps at work? Anyone? A couple of people? Okay, good. So you're like me, right? It took a while to figure out if these are useful. So strategizing, I want to make sure it's not a bad word anymore. I think we have to do a lot more of it. And what's really important, you'll see, is the feedback loops you're going to have between the tactics and the strategy. And what's really important, and again, this is extremely important because it's very relevant to sailing, right, is you use a map not because you're not going to take a risk, right? You don't use strategy because you want to remove all risk from the business. You want to use these to help communicate to your team why we're doing certain things and actually force yourself to have some visibility, right, to do some homework. What does the landscape look like, and how do you communicate to your teams? And that was the missing piece, right, that Scott never actually told me. It was in his gut. He was like, what maps are you building for the organization, and how are they helping you lead, right? Because there's this gap, and most organizations are yearning, right? There's a book that was written in 2009 called The New How, And the author coined a term called the air sandwich, right? And she did a bunch of research across heaps of organizations, and she saw that exact same pattern happening, right? The mission is clear and great, and the tactics are easy, and there's this air sandwich happening, and how do you fill that air sandwich? Maps, I think, are our tool. So, to make this a bit concrete, I use a lot of analogies and reasoning for it. I actually want to show 4 maps that we're starting to put in our toolbox that have been really helpful to actually explain this. I'll make this a bit more concrete than it's been so far. I think this is really interesting, like the difference between a map and a diagram. I think it's something that you want to start talking with your teams about. The reason why I like maps is maps are forcing function around direction, right? Things move on maps, right? Like what people are really allergic to is a strategy in the PowerPoint deck that you go, here's what we're doing for the next 3 years, that's our great destination, and that's my strategy, right? And that's like a bunch of BS, right? Because maps, things move on maps. You know, you start here, it's going to go there, right? That's the thing you want to talk about. You just don't want to talk about the fact that England is here. You want to talk about where you're going, and you're going around them. So maps have anchoring. The things you put on maps, the position you put them at are important, right? Diagrams, although still have lines and curves and all that, you use those to explain how things work, right? Which are still important, but I think it's really important to decide when do you want to map and when you want to diagram, and they're used for very different things. So I'm actually going to show examples of using both maps and diagrams, because I think both are really useful. And we underuse both of these things with our teams to explain a lot of things. So the first map is probably the most important for everyone. It's the one that has taken us, whether it be at Shopify, other companies I've been, to get to this point, and it's called the Wardley Map, which is actually, the guy's name is Simon Wardley, but this is literally your business map, right? And I think Jonathan mentioned it as a leader. If you don't understand the business, you can't do your job, right? Now, businesses are really shitty because most of them have never gone to school about how to explain what they're trying to do, so you're always be in some translation mode. And there's the most important questions about this map that you need as leading an engineering team is answering these two questions, right? What kinds of things is your company building? Because there's no way they're all the same things, right? There's no way that, in the sailing analogy, that the current's going to be the same wherever you're at the map, right? So what does that look like? How does everything fit together, right? You got this support system, right? You're not just building one thing. And the third thing that's really important is there any moves that are needed, right? Like, why are things moving on this map? So I'm going to spend probably more time on this map than the others, because I think this is the one that we're starting to use a lot more. And I'm going to talk about what the axes look like. Not sure if everyone can read this, but I'm going to go through what there's kind of 3 or 4 words on this map, on Wardley's map, that are really, really important. So the bottom axis, and again, this map is to map the kinds of things that you're building on your team, right? Giving them names. So the bottom axis is where you kind of understand that the things you're building are at different evolutionary stages, right? And we're going to use words like the evolution from experiment to infrastructure, right? Which is kind of how cities are built, right? You send the pioneers out to go figure out if we should be, building a city on this island in the St. Lawrence, and you send some pioneers out, and they discover and they lay out some initial infrastructure. Most of it's going to be ripped up. You've got at some point, you're like, wow, that was kind of a good idea. Let's go invest a bit more, right? So you got settlers, people are settling, and you have things in your company that have a very, very similar kind of workflow, right? And at some point, you're like, man, like, that was a great idea. Like, we want to enable more of those things, right? So let's invent a septic system so we can have toilets in large cities, right? So in your company, I guarantee you, if you went and categorized all the work that you're doing on right now and just simply tried to put it in one of these 3 categories, you're going to have a really interesting discussion with your team, right? Again, this goes back, this is not a list. Like most things when you're managing a team, right, it's not as simple as having a list of things, right? So this is, the first conversation here is understanding these types of things you're building, right, and talking to your team about it. So, an example, for example, that's from Shopify. I haven't talked to our lawyer to see if we can talk about this, but actually I'll talk about it pretty generically. So for example, Shopify we want to grow internationally. So we have a team working, let's say we go to India, and the other one goes to Japan for fun, right? So the first question I'd ask is, where does Japan fit on this slide, like on this map, right? And that's going to force you to decide, well, man, that's a good question. Like, what are we trying to do in Japan, right? So that conversation of trying to figure out where it fits is great. So in our case, Japan is a country that, although there's a language barrier and ultimately some cultural differences in how commerce works, it's actually fairly similar, right? So in terms of maturity of the market, in terms of maturity of commerce infrastructure, it's maybe not that different, right? So for us, Japan, you could say it's a bit of a feature, right? It's a bit of a feature. We've got to understand geography a bit more. When you think about India, it's like, well, that's a very different thing, right? That's a very different market. It's different. It's less mature. So right away, what that forces you to do is you're going to put Japan and India in a different part of this map, and you're going to have a conversation with your team about why are they at that different parts of the map. How do we, what kind of tactics we use, right? Because you know that pioneers and town builders, they don't even use the same tools, right? They probably don't even care about the same things. Their criteria of what success looked like is very, very different, right? So if you're not having that conversation, if you're not putting those things on this map and understanding why they're at different points, there's no strategy involved, right? I call it's a to-do list. There's no strategy and you're not having the right conversations. You're also probably not hiring the right people. You're not having the right tools, right? Because these things need very, very different kinds of things to be successful. The y-axis, actually, I forgot to talk about the impact. There's a bit of controversy about this one. This confuses people a bit, right? The y-axis could be, is it dollars? Is it how many customers you have on each one? We focused, at least this map, on really, again, it's about the type of work, right? The type of work, there's some work that's, again, evolutionary, and also in terms of who sees the work, right? The type of work, is it more invisible, and is it visible? So I assume there's different versions of this map, depending on kind of what, again, what ocean you want to cross, but this is one that's really useful about just understanding those relationships. So this is what a Wardley map with some stuff on it would look like, right? And this, again, is why a map is important, right? A map shows you the relationships, and these lines here are really as simple as, like, they're supporting each other in some way, right? And what can you do with this? You're like, you can ask yourself, are these things in the right spot? Should, thingy D be moving to infrastructure? How would we know that? Is it the same team that should be working on that? And you can start asking yourself, man, like, what's our team structure around this, right? Like, are we hiring the right kinds of people that do different kinds of work? Is our hiring process set up to hire, like, people who are really good at experiments versus people who are good at infrastructure? Do we know what that looks like? And you go to your CEO, you go, like, what, like, are we really good at infrastructure, right? Maybe we should get a partner to do some of this stuff, right? So this was something that I think I was really crappy at, right? In the RCA, my postmortem with leadership is not using these maps with the teams enough to pull out the conversations you need, which is the why you're doing certain work, right? And what's important, like, strategy is the why, right, and the movements, and having the conversation with the India team going, what your goal is versus Japan is different, was probably the most important strategic kind of discussion to have and to share with the company, right? So the Wardley, before I go to the job mag, again, I went through that really quickly. If you want to go browse the internet, this was not invented at Shopify. There's actually a lot of people who have been coming into these concepts. Kent Beck, who's at Facebook, recently actually wrote a post called, his most enlightening moment in the last couple of years is what he calls the product development triathlon, right? So you hear, and if you read his post, go Google it. He talks about the fact that he's spent his whole career, right, thinking that there's one way for a team to work, right? It's agile or it's pair programming, and he's realizing more and more, and that's why I call it the triathlon, is that there's these different kinds of work that has to happen, right? From swimming to like riding a bike, and his appreciation that those transition periods are probably one of the most strategic in your company, right? When you decide to go from an experiment to a feature, from a feature to infrastructure, like those conversations and the guidelines and the culture you build about doing that are going to make and break a lot of things that you're doing. If you want to look up Simon Wardley as well, there's a bunch of great articles about this that I've really just touched the surface of. So I'm going to go through 3 other maps, maybe a bit more quickly. The other one is a job map, right? Which is, it's a strategic conversation with your managers, what you expect from them, right? It's not a to-do list, right? You're not going to give your managers a to-do list of things to do. You want to give them a map, right? And the map are going to be the things you care about. So explain to your team like what the path to success looks like, right? Where are those ravines you're going to go through? You're going to show them by doing that what you value, right? Even you, as like you're their manager, you're their boss. At some point, there's a value system you have, and you have to be able to communicate that. And a map is going to force you to be more explicit than you think you need to be with your managers and your leads, right? Because often it's one-on-one. Hey, just do a good job. Make sure you Actually, you'll probably recite that mind map that I put at the beginning, right? You're going to give them a to-do list. There is no standard for this, so I'm going to show you one of many, many versions. This is one that I've used with my team a couple of times. There's no standards for this, but I think the conversation is useful. So my mental model, again, is I'm very much like feedback loopy. So I talk about, as a manager, you have to get good at really, at two things, right? Shipping today and shipping in months, right? And I talk about those as being important words I have to put on my map, because I believe as a leader that feedback loop you're going to get from doing those things is what's going to make you make good decisions. I'm giving you permission that you're allowed as a manager to go spend some time with teams shipping today, right? And that whatever you heard on the internet about being a hands-off manager is what you should aspire to is all a bunch of BS, right? Your job is to make good decisions. And you make good decisions by spending time in those two areas, right? It's not by spending time in one or the other. So the first chat I'm going to have with you, if you're on my team, is hopefully you're spending time across those two things. And the fact that they're on a map means that we can talk about that, right? We can talk about movement between them, how much time you should spend. And the columns are kind of areas that I think are kind of important, right? You got to spend time with your people. You have to spend time curating the work that's happening on your teams, right? Which is you're setting the standards of what quality looks like and what good engineering looks like. And you're going to find in a growing organization, there's a bunch of clarity that's needed, right? This is your job in uncovering, bubbling up, being the aggregator, and having a bit of a flashlight on what happens, right? So the first thing I'll do with this map is I'll say, your first year, just pick 2 columns to work in, right? Because you will not succeed by picking 3. It's impossible, right? So the chat we have on this map then is we talk about, what are the big things you're going to do and what are the small things, and pick 2 or 3 big things and pick 3 small things, right? Put them in one of these quadrants and make sure they're not all at the top. If they're all at the top, you're going to fail. You'll have no data to help you inform on what those are. If they're all at the bottom, you're not helping grow this organization, right? There's no way you're putting in some future seeds. So with this this is a super simple table. There's no math involved, there's no ML, right? It's literally a forcing function of that conversation, right? So how many people have had this kind of conversation with their boss before? A couple? Yeah? Some people from Shopify have, but... And again, these maps can be super simple. This is another version of that. You don't have to read all the words, right? Is just be a bit more explicit than you think, right? So this map is, again, reinforcing where you spend your time, right, is really important. And you need that feedback loop, right? So I'm actually even explaining, right? When you're in that tactical shipping days, here's some stuff that I'm okay with you doing, right? Because I think that's okay. So I think the map's going to give permission for people to do things that maybe you haven't communicated well or you should be a bit more explicit about. Okay, so Wardley Map, the business. The job map is what you expect from people on your team and what it means to be a good manager and a good leader. The craft map is going back to the functional org, right? We're all leading engineering teams or different disciplines, and there's a way of doing that, right? We want to understand what are our practices, how do we understand that? So outside of just writing, what language we're going to use, right? Am I allowed to use Go on my project, or can I use Spark? How does that work? What are the other conversations you have to have about how you do your craft, right, as a whole team? And it's a conversation that is important. So what you value and what's important about how you build things. So one of the first maps that I built with the team, it's probably 15 years ago, was I was on the founding team of the Eclipse platform, and my boss at the time, Eric Gama, was a great system thinker, right? And one of the first things he says is, we have to build a map, right? And at the time, I don't think we called it a map. We called it a diagram. Let's put some pictures on this piece of paper, which is, we had to scale our culture, right? At the time, we were a small team, about 15, 20 people, and we wanted to open source this platform, and we're like, holy crap, there's going to be like 2,000 people, maybe more, we want to come and actually develop and do some work with us. We're going to have to share what our values are and share what our things are, and this is what we came up with, right? And again, you're going to come up with a bunch of different maps. Like, there's no standardization, but it's having this kind of conversation, which is great, right? Which is great. So it's like, what do you put at the middle of your map, right? And why is it at the edge, right? At the middle of our map here at the time at Eclipse, milestones first was our most important cultural value, right? So this is like 2001, when all software was late, all software teams were shitty. Everybody had, like, we had as a discipline, had like probably the worst reputation in our history, right? Like, no one believed that you could build software effectively, right? So we came up and we realized we want to kind of debunk that myth. So milestones is something that's going to help us kind of keep a cadence and a drumbeat. So that was at the middle of our diagram, and we talked about it all the time. And then hence a bunch of other things that were important to our culture, right? And what's fascinating here is there's no programming language. There's no technology in here, right? These are like a value system and what you care about. So like, what's your map, right, for your team, for your craft, for how you do engineering? You discussed it, is important. Here's one that, a more simplistic one that we've shown at Shopify a couple times, right? I think we're evolving our Shopify one as we scale, but this is from a lot of experience realizing that, especially when you're a cloud company, a bit of what Tony said, if you don't have stable infrastructure, you can't get any other work done, right? So as a reminder to the team, I think I probably put this together like the first couple of months at Shopify. I told everyone, it is okay to work on all this boring infrastructure tooling stuff, a bit of what the Tony 10%, I think it might be more, right, in a SaaS company. That is a good thing, right? Without that, we'll not be able to do a bunch of other stuff, right? And the fact that I put this on this diagram at the bottom, I think was a good cultural statement, right? It's a cultural statement that you as a leader believe that it's okay to spend some time there, right? And let's put it on the diagram. And instead of milestones being at the middle, for me, it was a supporting function, right? That it's always going to be there. We're going to have to get good at it. Hence, a bunch of other stuff. Also, culturally is there's a lot of engineering teams who want to go out there and talk about what they're doing engineering-wise, either for recruiting. And I was like, listen, let's tell the world about what we're doing after we think we're doing a good job, right? So maybe some of you might not agree with my value, but I almost, I want to show off when we think we're actually doing a good job or not, and I explain why, right? So that these diagrams force you to explain, again, why you put things below or above certain things, right? And that conversation is that strategic conversation. So there's a typo. These are actually architecture diagrams, so I'm going to go from maps to diagrams right now. So as part of the engineering craft, right, we're going to talk about what we value, but also there's the what are we building right now. This is probably one of the most overlooked things. I believe that there was a allergic reaction to UML at some point in time, right? Everyone's had that another UML diagram, or everybody's used a tool that unfortunately I was at a company that we built some of these, but it was actually literally building a UML tool and all that. It was fascinating how I had a bit of that gag reflex, and I was like, man, these are terrible. It's getting in the way of coding. Let's look at algorithms. Let's look at the real things. And then I sit in a room, I sit in a room often, and I see engineers talking to each other, and they'll put code snippets up. They'll all nod their heads when they think, we have to build this fidgety do system that's going to do X, Y, Z. What do you guys think? And they're like, yeah, it sounds good. It's good. And the whiteboard was not touched, right? Like, nobody went to the whiteboard. And I was like, whoa, everybody. So what I do is I actually grab the pen. I go, okay, so I'm just going to draw what I think you heard, right? The first pass, and I want you to come up and correct me, right? Because I assume I got it wrong, right? And then I realized that, like, they all realized going like, oh yeah, we didn't talk about that part, right? We didn't talk about what that API, should there be an API there? Or so there was like, again, there was like this allergic reaction to actually getting to that level of, and this is kind of strategy, right? This is strategy of how you're going to build your system out. Do you care about responsibilities versus data structures? Force awareness outside your org structure, right? So you don't fit into Conway's law as you build things. There's another guy, again, his name's Simon Brown. If you just want to Google his name on the internet, he lives in the Channel Islands. He's actually a big sailor as well. He's been reigniting this discipline, right, of building architecture diagrams and using that as a strategic tool for technical teams to discuss how things work, right, and why, and have those discussions way before a pull request is created when you just see lines of code. So he talks about, different kinds of diagrams you can build. Like this is one where I'm just like, just draw a diagram, right? And for me, there's 3 types of architecture diagrams that have been like, make sure when you're solving different things that you have, maybe one of each, right? Context, containers, and components, which is basically outside to inside, and understand how they fit, and then have a forcing function for are the teams actually understanding each other, right? So that's the middle part. Those are 4 maps that are going to help you strategize. There's a couple of pitfalls, again, that I still run into this, shame on me, but you will show a strategy, right, whether it be a Wardley map or a job map to someone on your team or to a team, and they will all look at you with like a blank stare, right? And I've ignored that before, right? I remember giving a presentation at Shopify the first couple months, and I thought it was friggin' amazing, right? Here's where we're going. I showed a bit of a map, and then I didn't listen to everyone was nodding, and they're like, that's a really good idea, man, that's great. And then I realized that nothing was happening, right? I was like, we weren't moving there. And I was like, I didn't use the right scale, right? Like, don't use one scale of maps. If your team's not listening, I'm saying that actually it's your problem. You didn't communicate it well, right? And you're not getting a lot of feedback, is change the scale of your map, right? It's okay to go down one scale and go, before we talk about like system architectures, like what are the algorithms in that box, right? Like you have to, I think, adapt the maps that you're gonna use and the scale you're gonna use and get that really, and figure out as a leader, like how do you know if you're like, you use the right map, right? The right tool to communicate that. I got called out recently. I'm not sure if someone's in the room. Is Harry here? There's someone on my team who is, they said, I know you showed me that job map, Jean-Michel, but I want to know exactly what's in each one. I don't want to see a circle. Like, can you list me the things that you want me to do in each one of those squares? And I was like, shit, I should have done that 6 months ago, right? I could see that feedback coming, that, manager maybe like super high potential, but it's like first time going through that, and I had to give them, I had to create a smaller scale map that fit into each one of those squares that you saw. So be on the lookout, right? Like, be listening for that. Again, the other thing you do when you cross the Atlantic is you figure out if you're on the right path or not, right? So build out, again, you've probably heard this ad nauseum, but we do forget about this, which is metrics. I think Tony just blew us out of the water this morning with talk about gathering metrics, knowing if you're going in the right direction, and measuring. Like that's like really, really important for everything you're going to do. So this is going to go, again, this is something you got to build into your, this is a strategic thing, right? Like data is not tactical, right? It's strategic. It's going to help you decide, as Tony said this morning, are you on the right track? Which in Facebook case was, we want to stay really, really fast. And if you're not, like, what kind of data you can use to help you kind of readjust. So I guess my biggest takeaway is I gave you some tips for 4 maps that are useful. Be on the lookout. There's probably a lot more. There's probably more that I forgot to mention. But I think the key point, again, the key takeaway is figure out for you, number 1 is do a postmortem on your leadership style. 2 is, it might take you a while to figure out what the RCA is, or the root cause is. I completely agree with Tony, right? It takes a while. And the third thing is, don't be afraid of the word strategy, because that's where your job is. So, thanks for listening.
All right, let's see those hands.
It's lunchtime.
You covered everything.
I covered everything.
You covered everything. There's no questions. No questions? Oh, sorry. I have really bad eyesight. Okay.
Thanks. I love the analogy to maps and the way you use, I guess, visual amplifiers. I've heard that term used.
That's a great word, yeah.
Who on your team actually works on these things? Who builds them? Who draws them?
So here's the actually something I didn't mention. I think everyone does, right? Like, this is not a management tool. It's not like everyone has to be drawing maps, right? And that's why the scale is really important, right? You have different scales of them. So for me, this is more of a communication tool, right? And everyone has to do strategy. So I think you feel the pain a lot more as you scale, right? I think that everything's amplified, and we feel the pain because as a company, that air gap in the middle is something that people are going to look at leadership trying to fill, right? People look up going, there's a missing piece, there's some gaps. So I think it's going to hit the leadership team like earlier, but I think the tool is good for everyone.
Any other ones? All right.